The winter of 1888 killed a third of Harrow's Bluff, Montana. It buried the proud houses. It rotted the grain. It took the old and the weak first the way hard winters always do, without ceremony, without mercy, without apology. But before the winter came, there was a girl. And before the girl, there was an apple. And before the apple, there was a man who believed that what he owned was proof of what he was worth. That is where this story begins. Not in the snow, not in the storm, but in the small, quiet moment when a powerful man decided that a hungry child was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be helped. His name was Garrison Voss, and he was about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. Harrow's Bluff in the spring of 1886 was the kind of town that believed in itself with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been seriously tested. It sat in a broad valley at the foot of the Beartooth Range, cradled between two ridges of pale limestone that glowed amber in the evening light. The main street was freshly planked, still smelling of pine sap and ambition. The church steeple was the tallest structure for 40 miles in any direction, and the townspeople had paid extra for that height because height meant something on the frontier. Height meant you had arrived. There were 312 souls in Harrow's Bluff that spring, and most of them had come west with a particular kind of hunger. Not the hunger of desperation, but the hunger of men and women who had tasted the possibility of a new life and found it sweet enough to chase across a continent. They had built something here, something real, and that reality gave them a confidence that in the years ahead would prove to be their most dangerous quality. The man who embodied that confidence most completely was Garrison Voss. He had arrived in the valley 12 years earlier with a single mule, $300 in a money belt against his skin, and an instinct for commerce that was almost physical in its precision. He had opened the first general store when the town was still a surveyor's sketch. He had extended credit wisely and called it in wisely, and by 1886 his name was on the deed of 4 buildings on Main Street, a timber operation on the Eastern Ridge, and a controlling interest in the town's only grain elevator. He was 51 years old and built like a man who had once done hard physical labor and had since learned to make other men do it for him. His hands were large, his face was broad, and his voice had the particular authority of a man who had not been seriously contradicted in a very long time. He was not, by the standards of the frontier, a cruel man. He did not drink to excess or raise his hand to his family or cheat his business partners in ways that could be proven in court. He gave to the church regularly and employed a third of the town in one capacity or another. But he had built his life on a foundation of absolute certainty about the natural order of things. There were men who built and men who depended on those builders. There were those who created wealth and those who merely consumed it. The world was a hierarchy as natural and inevitable as a mountain range, and Garrison Voss had climbed to a comfortable elevation and intended to stay there. He had never seriously considered what the view looked like from the bottom. Willa Thorne was 13 years old in the spring of 1886, and she had been living at the bottom for 6 months. Her parents, Elias and Ruth Thorne, had been geologists, which was a profession that Harrow's Bluff regarded with a particular suspicion reserved for pursuits that seemed too much like thinking and not enough like working. Elias had come to Montana following rumors of geothermal activity in the Beartooth Range, a phenomenon that fascinated him with the intensity of a man who had found his life's true purpose and would follow it anywhere, even into the mountain's dark heart. He had found what he was looking for in the end. The mountain had given him exactly what he came seeking. It had also kept him. In the autumn of 1885, Elias and Ruth Thorne had gone up into the northern face of Shadow Ridge on a clear October morning to survey a series of rock formations that Elias had been mapping for 3 years. They had not come back. The search party found their equipment at the entrance to a deep fissure in the basalt and nothing else. Willa had been left in the care of the town's widow network, a loose arrangement of aging women who took in strays out of Christian duty and residual frontier solidarity. She had moved from house to house in the months that followed, sleeping in back rooms, eating what was left after the family had eaten, wearing clothes that had been intended for other children. She was quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned that their presence is conditional on their behavior. She did not complain. She did not ask for things she knew would not be given. She observed everything and said little, and in the privacy of her own mind, she cataloged the world with the same precise attention her father had given to rock formations. She had his eyes gray and steady, the eyes of a person who is always calculating depth and distance. She had her mother's hands long-fingered, careful the hands of someone who understood that the natural world responded to patience rather than force. And she had the particular hunger of a child who has been going to bed with an insufficient supper for 6 months. It was a Tuesday in late April when she stood before Voss's emporium and looked at the barrel of apples by the front door. They were last season's fruit, soft with age, their skins dimpled and brownish. The kind of apples that had passed beyond human appeal and were waiting for their transformation into slop for the pigs in Voss's pen behind the building. No one had touched them in days. The barrel sat in the morning sun, giving off a faint, fermented sweetness that cut through the cool spring air and found Willa's hunger with the precision of a key finding a lock. She stood there for what felt like a long time. She was not by nature a thief. She understood consequences with the clarity of a child who has had to understand them early. She weighed the risk against the hunger, and she weighed the hunger against the moral weight of taking something that was in the most technical sense not hers. But those apples were going to the pigs, and she had not eaten since the previous morning. Her hand moved before her mind had fully authorized it. Small fingers calloused from months of chores done in exchange for room and board closed around an apple that was soft enough to yield to the pressure of her grip. She drew it back. She had it. Thief. The word hit the air like a rifle shot. Garrison Voss stood on the boardwalk above her, and his face held the expression of a man who has just had a principle violated. Not property, a principle. The principle that things in this world belong to the people who had earned them, and that the natural order he had built his life on was not subject to exception, not even for hungry children. He came down the steps with the deliberate speed of a man in no hurry, because the outcome is already certain. He took the apple from her hand. She did not resist. There was no point in resisting. Just like your vagrant parent is, he said, taking what isn't theirs. The words landed differently than a slap, harder, in a place that didn't heal the same way skin does. Mayor Silas Merrick's office smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the particular anxiety of a man who has spent his career trying to please everyone and has consequently pleased no one fully. Merrick was 53 with the soft midsection and careful eyes of a political animal, a man who had survived by being useful to the people with power and invisible to the people without it. He had been mayor for 6 years because Garrison Voss had decided that the town needed a mayor and that Merrick specifically should be that mayor. The arrangement had worked well for both of them in the way that arrangements between powerful men and useful men generally do. He sat behind his desk and looked at Willa Thorne the way a man looks at a problem he has not been given sufficient authority to solve. 2 of Voss's associates occupied the chairs along the wall, men whose primary qualification for town council membership was their willingness to agree with Voss in an official capacity. They sat with the patient confidence of men who knew how this would end. "What do you have to say for yourself, girl?" Merrick asked, avoiding her eyes. Willa stood straight. Her hands were at her sides. She had cleaned the worst of the dirt from her face with the sleeve of her coat on the walk over, and she looked at the mayor with those gray, calculating eyes that made men subtly uneasy in ways they couldn't quite name. "I was hungry, sir. They were going to the pigs." "Property is property," Voss said from his position by the window, his back half turned to the room as though the proceedings were already resolved and he was merely allowing them to catch up. "We cannot have vagrancy and theft in a town called Harrow's Bluff. It is an affront to order." Merrick cleared his throat. "Mr. Voss, she's just a child who stole. The age doesn't change the act." There was a silence in which Merrick did what he always did when caught between conscience and convenience. He calculated. He measured. He found, as he almost always found, that convenience was heavier on his particular scale. "She has no family," one of the council members offered. "No means." Voss turned from the window then, and there was something in his expression that Willa would think about for years afterward, not malice exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a man who has found an elegant solution to an inconvenient problem. "Her parents filed a claim on the north slope of Shadow Ridge before they died," he said. "The land is worthless, everyone knows that, but it's hers by inheritance." He paused, letting the shape of what he was proposing settle into the room. "Let her have it. Let her go there and fend for herself. An exile proportionate to her crime." Merrick's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Voss, that slope is her parents' land, their legacy. It seems fitting that she follow in their footsteps. The cruelty of the reference was so clean, so precise, that several people in the room flinched before they caught themselves. Merrick looked at the girl. He looked at Voss. He looked at his own hands as though they might offer some alternative. "You will take your parents' horse and their tools," Voss said, addressing Willa directly now, "and you will be gone by sunrise. If you are seen in this valley again, you will be remanded to the territorial authorities." He turned back to the window. "I can survive there," Willa said. The room went very still. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that cut through the stillness of the office, with a quality that had nothing to do with volume. It was the voice of a person making a statement of fact rather than an appeal for sympathy. Merrick stared at her. Voss turned slowly. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention for what may have been the first time. What he saw was a small, thin, dirt-grimed 13-year-old girl who had just stolen a pig's apple and was now calmly telling him she could survive on the most inhospitable piece of rock in the county. "My father showed me the signs," she continued. "There's warmth in that mountain. He mapped it." Voss let a short, sharp sound escape him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal. The sound a man makes when he has heard something too absurd to treat seriously but too bizarre to ignore entirely. "Warmth in the mountain," he repeated. He shook his head. "Go find your warmth, little thief." Willa looked for just a moment not at Voss but at the map on the wall behind the mayor's desk. It was a surveyor's map of the valley and the surrounding ranges, and the north slope of Shadow Ridge was marked clearly a pale, unmarked expanse that the cartographer had not bothered to annotate because there was apparently nothing there worth noting. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at maps, not as a picture of what was, but as a question about what might be. Then she turned and walked out of the office. The next morning, the entire town of Harrow's Bluff came out to watch. This was the frontier, and spectacle was rare enough that people made time for it. They stood on the boardwalks and in the doorways and at the ends of alleys, and they watched a 13-year-old girl load her parents' belongings onto a pack sled, hitched to a gray mare the color of old pewter. The mare's name was Cinder, not a name Willa had given her, but a name her father had assigned years earlier in recognition of a patch of dark gray on the horse's left flank that darkened to near black in wet weather. Cinder was 17 years old, which was not young for a horse, but she was steady and deep-chested, and she had a quality of stubborn loyalty that Willa had come to regard as one of the most valuable things left in her life. The sled held what remained of Elias and Ruth Thorne's legacy, a pickaxe and a broad-bladed shovel, both with handles worn smooth by years of expert use. A prospector's toolkit, chisels, probes, rock hammers of 3 different weights. 4 crates of books, mostly geological texts, but also Ruth's volumes on native plant species and her careful journals of field observations. A canvas tent, 2 wool blankets, a cast iron pot, a small crate of seed packets that Ruth had been collecting and preserving for years, heirloom varieties carefully dried and labeled in her small, precise handwriting. And at the very bottom of the largest crate, beneath the geological texts and the seed packets, in the accumulated weight of 2 lost lives, something that Willa had not yet found. She would find it tonight, on the mountain, in the dark. But that is getting ahead of the story. She led Cinder down Main Street with her eyes forward and her spine straight, and the whispers followed her like weather. "Good riddance," muttered Bridger Hale, standing at the edge of the crowd, with his thumbs in his belt loops and the casual contempt of a man who has never gone without. Hale was the town's most prominent builder, a craftsman of genuine skill who had constructed the majority of Harrow's Bluff's finest structures, including Voss's Emporium and the town hall, and his own substantial home on the north end of Main Street with its second-floor veranda and its large glass windows that caught the morning light. He was proud of those buildings. He had built them tall and fine and prominent, and he regarded them as evidence of his own contribution to civilization. "The Gopher's Palace," he said loud enough to carry. "That's what she'll have up there." He grinned at the men around him. "Little Gopher digging her hole." There was laughter. It moved through the crowd like a wave, and on the crest of that wave, Hale's son, 18-year-old Cade, broad-shouldered and easy in the manner of young men who have never been hungry, took up the rhythm of it and let his own laughter join the rest. The children had a rhyme by afternoon. It was cruel the way children's rhymes are cruel rhymes that find the exact wound and press on it. Willa heard it once. She did not look back. Garrison Voss stood on the porch of his emporium and watched her go. He was thinking at that moment not about Willa Thorne, but about the new storehouse he was planning to build on the eastern end of Main Street. He had been designing it in his mind for 2 years, a substantial structure, purpose-built for grain storage, with thick timber walls and a deep cellar lined with fieldstone. He had priced the materials. He had engaged a contractor from Billings who specialized in commercial construction. The total cost would be $4,000, which was by the standards of Harrow's Bluff a colossal sum, and Voss intended it to be. The storehouse would be his monument, a physical argument written in lumber and stone for the permanence of what he had built here. He watched the girl reach the edge of town and turn north, Cinder's heavy hooves raising small clouds of spring dust, and he felt the clean satisfaction of a man who has resolved a problem neatly. He went back inside. He did not think about Willa Thorne again for a very long time. The north slope of Shadow Ridge was everything Garrison Voss had implied it was, and nothing that Willa's father had led her to fear. She arrived at dusk on the first day, having navigated by the maps she had memorized over years of sitting beside her father while he worked tracing the contour lines with her finger, while he explained what they meant. The light was failing by the time she found the narrow game trail that switchbacked up the northern face, and the temperature was dropping with the rapid efficiency of mountain evenings, the warmth bleeding out of the air, the way it bleeds out of hope. The slope was barren in the way that high mountain faces are barren, not dead exactly, but stripped to essentials. Rock and wind-bent juniper, patches of last year's dead grass, a sky overhead that was enormous and indifferent. She set up the canvas tent in the lee of a limestone outcrop and put Cinder on a long tether where there was some dry grass from the previous season. She built a small fire and ate the last of the food she had brought, a piece of dried venison and 2 biscuits, and sat in the dark with the fire between her and the wind and tried to think. The problem with exile she was discovering was not the physical deprivation. It was the silence. A silence that was different from ordinary quiet, because ordinary quiet is merely the absence of sound. This silence had presence. It was the silence of complete aloneness, the silence of a world that has no particular interest in whether you live or die, and she sat inside it and felt its full weight for the first time in her life. She was 13 years old. She was 3 miles from the nearest human settlement. She had 2 blankets, 4 crates of books, a shovel, and a horse. And she had her father's maps. She opened the largest crate by firelight, moving carefully through the geological texts with their hand-drawn illustrations, and that is when she found it. At the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with 3 separate lengths of twine, was a leather journal she had never seen before. It was not one of her father's standard field notebooks, which were always plain-covered and numbered sequentially. This one was different. Thicker, older the leather, dark with handling, the cover embossed in the lower right corner with the single letter, E. Elias. She unwrapped it with fingers that had begun to tremble, though whether from cold or from something else she could not have said. Inside the front cover, in her father's careful geologist script, was a note. Willa, if you are reading this, then the mountain has given you what I was looking for. I'm sorry I could not be there to show you myself. Everything you need to know about Shadow Ridge is in these pages. The mountain breathes, sweetheart. You just have to know where to listen. She sat with the journal in her lap for a long time. The fire burned down to orange coals. Cinder shifted in the darkness and blew a long, warm breath into the cold air. Willa did not sleep that night. She read. The journal was 30 years of her father's geological work on Shadow Ridge, beginning when he was a young man of 22, who had first come to the Beartooth Range as part of a government survey team and had noticed something in the rock formation of the northern face that the other surveyors had either not seen or had dismissed as irrelevant, a geothermal anomaly. Deep beneath the surface of Shadow Ridge, in the slow dark miles below the basalt and the limestone and the ancient compressed sediment, there was heat. Not the ordinary heat of rock at depth which existed everywhere and was of limited practical use, but a concentrated pocket of thermal activity, residual volcanic energy, from a system that had been active 40,000 years ago and had never quite gone fully cold. This heat was not static. It moved. It followed the fissures and channels of the rock structure, the way water follows topography, finding its paths of least resistance, surfacing in specific locations as warm springs and steam vents in areas of elevated ground temperature. Elias Thorne had spent 3 decades mapping these pathways with the patience and precision of a man who understood that the best secrets kept themselves hidden until you had earned the right to find them. And on page 47 of the journal, he had drawn a map. It was extraordinary in its detail, a cross-sectional view of the northern face of Shadow Ridge, showing the thermal pathways in red ink against the geological strata drawn in careful pencil. The warm springs were marked with small circles. The steam vents were marked with arrows indicating the direction of flow. The areas of elevated surface temperature were shaded. And in the center of it all, marked with a firm, confident X in red ink, was a location on the northern face approximately 200 feet above the current tree line. Beside the X in her father's handwriting, lava tube approximately 50 feet deep, ambient temperature 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, geothermal water source inside, suitable for habitation with modification. This is yours, Willa, if you ever need it. She read the words 3 times. Then she turned to the next page and the next, and the page after that, absorbing 20 years of geological detail about a piece of supposedly worthless rock that was in fact alive with the slow, patient warmth of the earth itself. Garrison Voss had given her a death sentence. What he had actually given her was the most valuable piece of real estate in Harrow's Bluff County. He just didn't know it yet. She found the entrance the following morning just before noon, exactly where the map indicated it would be. It was hidden behind a curtain of ancient junipers that had grown into the rock face over generations, their roots finding purchase in cracks that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. The rock wall behind the junipers appeared at first glance to be solid, but when Willa pressed her hand flat against the surface and held it there, she felt it. Warmth. Not the warmth of sunlight on stone, which was a different quality, entirely surface heat dependent on the angle of the light and gone by evening. This was something deeper, something that did not depend on the sun because it came from the opposite direction, entirely rising from below, from the slow geological engine that had been running in the dark heart of this mountain since before the first human eye had ever looked upon these peaks. She closed her eyes. Her father's voice came to her from 3 years ago in his study, bent over one of his geological texts with the lamp pulled close. The earth is not cold, Willa. That is the fundamental misunderstanding that people have about rock. Stone feels cold to the touch because it conducts heat away from your skin faster than air does. But the earth itself is hot, has been hot since before life existed, and will be hot long after we're gone. In certain places, that heat comes close enough to the surface that you can feel it. Those places are sacred in their way. The earth breathing. She pressed her palm harder against the stone. The earth breathing. She stepped through the junipers and found the fissure in the rock face narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders angled downward for the first 6 feet before it opened into a low-ceilinged chamber. The air inside was close and mineral-smelling, with an undertone of sulfur that was not unpleasant, just distinct the smell of geology in progress. And it was warm. Not dramatically warm, not the warmth of a heated room or a banked fire, but the steady, consistent warmth of a temperature that does not change with the weather outside. 55 degrees, her father had written, and it felt exactly right. In the spring air outside, where temperatures were swinging between 40 in the day and 20 at night, 55 degrees felt like an embrace. She sat down on the stone floor and breathed. She was a 13-year-old girl who had been sent here to die. The mountain was warm. Her father had known it would be. She thought about what Garrison Voss had said in the mayor's office, the casual certainty of his dismissal, the sound that had escaped him when she said there was warmth in the mountain. The sound of a man absolutely confident in the limits of a world that, in this particular instance, extended considerably beyond what he could see. She thought about the journal in her pack. 30 years of her father's life wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a crate, waiting for her. She thought about the $4,000 storehouse that Voss was planning to build in the valley below, and about the grain it would hold, and about the pride with which he would stand before the town council and declare that Harrow's Bluff was secure. She did not know, sitting there in the warm dark of her father's discovery, exactly what the future held. She could not have predicted the storm. She could not have known what the winter of 1888 would take from the valley below or what it would demand of everyone who survived it. But she understood with the bone-deep certainty of a girl who had been reading geological maps since she was old enough to hold a pencil that what her father had found here was not nothing. It was everything. And Garrison Voss had given it to her. She pulled the journal from her pack. She opened it to the cross-sectional map. She traced the thermal pathways with her finger, the warm springs, the steam vents, the lava tube that extended 50 feet into the mountain's interior. Then she picked up the pickaxe. She had a great deal of work to do. Work is its own kind of language. Not the language of words which can be shaped to deceive, or the language of money which can be inherited or stolen or stumbled into by luck. Work is the language of consequence, the only tongue in which what you say and what you mean are always, without exception, exactly the same thing. Willa Thorne learned this in the first week on the mountain, when the pickaxe raised blisters on her palms that split open and bled into the rock dust, and the rock did not care, and the work did not stop. And she learned to wrap her hands in strips of her mother's old canvas and keep going. She learned it in the second week, when the fissure she was widening collapsed a section of its upper wall and buried 3 days of excavated material back into the passage, and she moved it again stone by stone with the deliberate patience of someone who has accepted that there are no shortcuts available to her. She learned it in the third week when her muscles had hardened enough that the pickaxe swings felt different, cleaner, more efficient, the tool becoming an extension of her body rather than a foreign object her body was fighting against. By the end of the first month, Willa Thorne had stopped being a child doing an adult's work. She had simply become someone who worked. The journal was her guide and her companion through all of it. Her father had not merely mapped the thermal system beneath Shadow Ridge. He had, with the meticulous care of a man who lived inside his own mind and kept detailed records there, described exactly how the system might be utilized by a person who understood its properties. He had sketched possible configurations for the lava tube's interior, how the space might be expanded along the existing geological channels without compromising the structural integrity of the ceiling rock. He had noted which sections of the tube wall were basalt, which were limestone, which were composite formations that would respond differently to the chisel. He had calculated the thermal water flow from the geothermal spring at the tube's interior, noting its temperature, its mineral content, its volume per hour. He had even designed in careful pencil on pages 48 through 52 a rudimentary irrigation channel, a shallow carved groove running along the western wall that would carry warm water from the spring to the areas he had designated for cultivation, maintaining both moisture and the elevated temperature that the right plants would need to survive. Ruth Thorne had filled the corresponding pages with plant science. Her handwriting was smaller than her husband's, more compressed, the handwriting of a woman who had a great deal to say and was always aware of the finite space available to say it in. She had researched cold-tolerant and low-light cultivars with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had understood perhaps more clearly than her husband that the theoretical value of this discovery depended entirely on whether a human being could actually live inside it. Kale, specifically the Siberian variety, which could tolerate temperatures down to 15 degrees, but thrived in the kind of steady, mild warmth the tube would provide. Carrots, the Danvers variety, bred for heavy clay soils, which would adapt to the volcanic substrate her husband had identified in the tube floor. Mushrooms, oyster varieties that actively preferred the darkness and humidity of enclosed spaces. Potatoes, the Irish lumper, which her notes described as practically indestructible, under most conditions, a quality that Willa would come to regard as the most important characteristic a plant could have. And seeds. Ruth had spent years collecting and preserving heirloom varieties, plants chosen not for their commercial appeal, but for their hardiness, their nutritional density, their ability to reproduce reliably without sophisticated intervention. The seed packets in the bottom of the crate were Ruth Thorne's most considered gift to her daughter, more considered perhaps than Ruth herself had known when she packed them, or perhaps exactly as considered as she had known. Willa had begun to understand that her parents had known more than they had said and had prepared more than they had revealed, and that the mountain and the journal and the seed packets were all of a piece. A provision assembled by two people who loved their daughter and understood with the particular clarity of people who'd spent their lives reading the evidence written in stone that the world is not as stable as it appears. She expanded the main chamber through the summer of 1886, working 6 to 8 hours each day, with the pickaxe and the broad shovel, following the geological pathways her father had mapped, with a fidelity that came from trust rather than blind obedience. She understood enough now to see why he had drawn the lines where he had drawn them, to see the logic of the rock's structure and how the expansion could follow that structure rather than fighting it. Cinder helped. The old mare had over 17 years of working beside Elias Thorne, developed a calm tolerance for enclosed spaces and unfamiliar tasks that made her invaluable. Willa rigged a simple harness system using her father's rope and the pack sled, and Cinder dragged loads of excavated rock and soil out of the growing cave and down the slope where Willa dumped them in an expanding berm that she was slowly shaping into a windbreak for the cave entrance. It was brutal work for both of them, but Cinder was steady and Willa was learning to be. The timbering of the ceiling was the most technically demanding part of the construction, and the part where her father's journal was most indispensable. Elias had worked briefly in a copper mine in his 20s before geology had become his vocation, and he had written extensively about the principles of underground support, how to read the rock above you, how to identify sections that needed reinforcement, how to cut and place timber in a way that distributed load rather than concentrating it at vulnerable points. Willa had no formal training in any of this. What she had was a journal written by a man who had known she might need exactly this information and the kind of focused attention that comes from understanding that a mistake in the ceiling means the ceiling comes down on your head. She was careful. She was methodical. And by the end of the summer, the main chamber, 50 feet long, 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that varied between 6 and 8 feet in height, was timbered and stable. She partitioned the eastern end for Cinder, constructing a low wall of stacked stone that separated the horses area from the cultivation space while allowing the warm air to circulate freely. She dug the irrigation channel along the western wall, spending 2 full weeks getting the grade right, so the water would flow by gravity alone. No pumping required, no mechanism to break at the worst possible moment. She affixed the mica sheets. This had been Ruth's idea, and it was the most ingenious element of the whole system. The cave entrance faced north, which meant it received no direct sunlight at any point in the year. This was a structural advantage. It meant the entrance was hidden from casual observation, and it meant the temperature differential between inside and outside was minimized because no direct sun would heat the entrance rock and drive warm air out. But it also meant darkness. Ruth had known about the mica deposits on the claim. She had written about them in her field journals, which Willa had read as a child without fully understanding their significance. Mica muscovite, specifically the pale, lustrous variety that split into thin, transparent sheets, reflected light with an efficiency that was startling until you understood the physics of it, and Ruth had understood the physics of it with the precision of a naturalist who had spent years observing how light behaved in forest interiors and cave systems. Willa spent 2 weeks splitting the mica deposits into sheets and affixing them to the walls opposite the entrance, angling them carefully to catch and redirect the indirect light that entered from outside. The effect was not dramatic. This was not sunlight, and the cave was not bright. But it was not dark either. The pale, diffuse, silvery luminescence that the mica sheets created was enough to work by, enough to read by in the hours near midday, when the light outside was strongest enough to see the color of a plant leaf and assess whether it was healthy. It was in its modest way extraordinary. The garden beds went in during the last weeks of summer. She had spent weeks during the construction process reading her mother's notes on soil composition, understanding that the volcanic substrate of the lava tube floor, dark, mineral-rich, slightly acidic, needed amendment before it would support the kind of cultivation she was planning. Ruth had written with characteristic precision about the nutritive properties of bat guano, which she had observed being used as a soil amendment in several of the agricultural communities she had visited during fieldwork. The colony of bats that roosted in a secondary chamber off the main tube had been producing guano for, by Willa's estimate, several decades. The secondary chamber floor was covered with it several inches of the dark, powerful material that smelled strongly of ammonia and life, and the deep biological productivity of creatures that had been eating insects and returning them to the earth in concentrated form for 30 years. She moved it with a shovel and a cloth over her nose and added it to the tube floor in the cultivation area, working it into the volcanic soil and the decomposed organic material that had accumulated near the entrance over years of windblown debris. She built raised bed frames from the lumber she had salvaged from 2 collapsed mining structures she had found on the upper slope structures that predated her parents' claim and had been abandoned when the ore ran out. Then she planted kale first, because her mother's notes indicated it would establish fastest and because Willa was hungry enough to want something to eat before winter. Then carrots and potatoes pressed into the amended soil of the deeper beds with the care of someone who understood that these seeds were not replaceable, that what she was planting was not just food, but the possibility of food and the possibility after that, and the possibility after that in a chain of agricultural continuation that would extend as far as she took care to maintain it. The mushroom spores she cultivated on logs she had dragged from the slope outside using the method her mother had described in a passage so detailed that it read less like a journal entry and more like a set of instructions left deliberately for someone who would need them. By mid-September, 6 weeks after the first seeds went in, the first green shoots were visible in the kale beds. Willa sat beside them for a long time and did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the green could not express more clearly. That winter, her first winter on the mountain, 1886 into 1887, nearly broke her. Not the cold and not the isolation and not the physical hardship of maintaining the cave through months when the snow outside piled against the entrance and had to be cleared every 2 days to prevent it from sealing off the ventilation. She had expected all of those things. She had prepared for them as thoroughly as her father's journal and her own careful thinking allowed. What she had not prepared for was the night in late January when she woke at 3 in the morning to find the cave's ambient temperature had dropped 8 degrees in a single hour. She knew immediately what it meant. A thermal fluctuation her father had warned about them in the journal brief periods when the geothermal flow decreased for reasons that were related to the complex pressure dynamics of the underground system and where he had written honestly not entirely predictable. He had noted that they were temporary, that they passed, that the system reestablished its equilibrium within 12 to 48 hours. What he had not known, because he had not been there to observe it, was that 8 degrees in a lava tube garden in January was the difference between plants that survive and plants that do not. She did everything she could. She moved the lanterns close to the beds and kept them burning all night. She strung her spare wool blankets over the most vulnerable plants, the kale seedlings, that were 2 weeks from their first real harvest. She sat beside the beds in her coat and hat, with her knees drawn to her chest, and kept vigil through the coldest hours of the night, moving from bed to bed, touching leaves, assessing, monitoring. By morning, the temperature had begun to recover. The thermal system was stabilizing. But when the light returned and she could see clearly what the night had done, she found what she had feared she would find. The kale beds were dead, not partially damaged, not salvageable with care. Dead, the leaves blackened and collapsed the soft tissue of the plants, destroyed by the temperature drop at their most vulnerable stage of development. The potato beds had survived being deeper and more protected, and the mushroom logs were unaffected. But the kale, which she had been counting on as her primary green vegetable source through the winter months, was gone. She sat in the dim silver light of the mica-reflected morning and looked at what 6 weeks of work had produced and what one night had taken. The silence of the cave was absolute. She picked up the last surviving kale seedling, a single small plant that had been closest to the thermal spring and had apparently caught just enough warmth to survive, and held it in her palm. It was 3 inches high and fragile as hope, and she sat there with it in her hand and felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment pressing down on her from all sides. She was 13 years old. She was alone on a mountain in January. She had just lost her winter vegetable supply. And outside 5 feet of snow separated her from a world that had decided she was not worth its consideration. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour of despair. This was not a rule she had made consciously. It was something she discovered about herself in that hour. That grief and fear and the particular loneliness of her situation were things she could feel fully and then with effort set aside. Not because they weren't real, because they weren't useful. And she had been raised by 2 people who were always, in the end, more interested in what was useful than in what was comfortable. After an hour, she opened her mother's seed journal. She found the entry she was looking for on page 31. Ruth had written it after a field season in 1879, when a late frost had destroyed her experimental garden plot, and she had spent 3 weeks recovering the soil and replanting from secondary seed stocks she had kept in reserve specifically for this contingency. The first garden teaches you what works, Ruth had written. The second garden teaches you what lasts. Below the entry, she had cataloged her reserve seed stocks. And there, in Ruth Thorne's small, compressed handwriting, was a note about Siberian kale replant immediately after loss. This variety recovers faster from cold damage than any other brassica I have worked with. The cold that kills the established plant also softens the seed coat of the replacement, allowing faster germination. A hard winter is not only a threat, it is also a preparation. Willa read the passage twice. Then she went to the seed reserve, A small tin box her mother had packed separately from the main seed collection, labeled secondary stock in red ink, and she took out the kale seeds and she planted them again. She adjusted the bed placement, moving it closer to the thermal spring's influence. She constructed a simple cold frame over the beds using salvaged glass from a lantern case and thin strips of wood, creating a microclimate 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding cave air. She monitored the thermal system with a new attentiveness, checking the cave temperature 3 times daily and recording it in her own journal, learning to read the patterns, understanding that the fluctuations had a rhythm she could not control but could anticipate. The second kale bed grew back stronger than the first. Her mother had known it would, and Willa Thorne, 13 years old on a mountain in Montana in the winter of 1887, learned the most important lesson of her life, not from success but from destruction, and not from the destruction, but from what came after it. You do not survive by avoiding loss. You survive by knowing what to do when loss arrives. Down in Harrow's Bluff, the seasons turned with the comfortable regularity of a prosperous town's calendar. Spring brought planting and the optimism that always accompanied the turning of fresh soil. Summer brought growth and the particular satisfaction of watching what you have invested in respond as you hoped it would. The harvest of 1887 was good, not exceptional, but solid, and the mood in town was the quiet confidence of people who had expected the world to cooperate and found this time at least that it had. Garrison Voss's new storehouse was under construction through the spring and summer of 1887. It rose from its foundation on the eastern end of Main Street with the unhurried confidence of a structure built by men who knew they were building something permanent. The contractor from Billings had brought a crew of 12, and the sound of hammers and saws was the town's ambient music. Through those months, the sound of prosperity and the act of becoming more prosperous. Voss visited the construction site every morning. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and assessed the progress the way he assessed all his investments, with the patient attention of a man who believes that his oversight is itself a form of contribution and that things watched carefully tend to go well. He did not know, could not have known, because no one told him that the contractor from Billings had a habit when working far from his home territory of cutting small corners in materials where the cuts were unlikely to be noticed. The main structural timbers were as specified, but the secondary framing, the interior support members that gave the walls their rigidity against lateral pressure, had been replaced with slightly lighter gauge lumber than the plans called for. And the difference would matter only under the kind of extraordinary stress that, in the contractor's experience, commercial buildings in Montana Valley towns did not typically encounter. The lumber was not properly cured either. It had been cut late in the previous season and dried for 6 months rather than the 18 that good construction practice recommended. The contractor knew this. He had done his calculation and decided that 6 months was sufficient for the climate in the application. He had not consulted the climate. In the summer of 1887, the storehouse was completed, and Garrison Voss held a dinner for the town council and their wives in the building's interior, beneath the heavy beams and the smell of new wood, and made a speech about the security and permanence of what Harrow's Bluff had built together. The contractor from Billings had gone home by then with his fee and his secrets. Through the summer of 1887, the hunters who worked the high ridges above Harrow's Bluff began to bring back reports. The Thorne girl was still up there. This was to most of the town a piece of information that produced a sensation somewhere between surprise and embarrassment. Most people had assumed she was dead. The assumption had been comfortable. It resolved the story in the simplest way, turned a potentially troubling exile into a tragedy that could be mourned in the abstract without requiring anyone to examine their role in producing it. The news that she was alive complicated things. "Looks half wild," reported one hunter who had spotted her from a high ridge working outside the cave entrance in the summer heat. "Covered in dirt, hauling rocks like a—" He paused, choosing his word with the awareness of a man in a saloon who has stumbled onto something slightly delicate. "Like she means it." The town absorbed this information and made of it what it could. "Going gopher," Bridger Hale said one evening at the saloon, and the table laughed, and the phrase that had begun as an offhand mockery of a 13-year-old girl's exile began to settle into the town's vocabulary as a fixed expression used to describe any undertaking that combined maximum effort with minimum wisdom. Any man who had convinced himself that his particularly foolish project was somehow different from all the other foolish projects any soul devoted to a lost cause with more passion than sense. He's going gopher on that irrigation scheme. Don't go gopher on me, Bill. Just hire a professional. That whole venture has a gopher smell to it. Kate Hale used it most freely with the casual authority of someone who had been present at its coining and regarded the phrase as a small inheritance. He was 19 now, broad-shouldered and easy-voiced, a young man who had his father's confidence and his father's slightly limited field of vision. And he used the phrase without malice because for him, it required no malice. It was simply true. Obviously true, the kind of truth you didn't need to argue for because the argument was already settled. That girl was up there digging her hole in the mountain, and everyone knew why that was foolish, and the only thing left to do was find a name for the quality of foolishness she represented. He did not know, none of them knew, that the girl they were describing had just completed the second of her 2 geothermal irrigation channels and was currently transplanting her third succession of kale into beds that were producing more reliably than any garden in the valley below. The autumn of 1888 arrived with a particular quality of light that Willa had learned over 2 years on the mountain to pay close attention to. She was 15 now, and she was not the girl who had arrived here with 2 blankets and a pickaxe. The work had remade her the way the mountain remade everything it touched, slowly, thoroughly, without sentiment, in ways that were invisible in the moment and undeniable in the result. She was lean and strong, and she moved with the economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy, not from laziness, but from the sophisticated understanding that energy is a resource like any other, finite and precious, and not to be spent carelessly. Her world had the ordered quality of a system that has been built and refined over time. The main chamber of the cave, she had long since stopped thinking of it as a cave, was her home in the fullest sense. The kale beds along the western wall were in their 6th succession, producing reliably in the warm glow of the mica-reflected light. The potato beds in the deeper interior were mounded with healthy foliage. The mushroom logs were fruiting in their 3rd cycle. Cinder's area was clean and well-bedded with dry grass that Willa harvested from the slope below each autumn. She had added 2 goats the previous spring, trading 3 months' worth of surplus mushrooms to a passing trapper who had more animals than he needed and was heading into winter with an excess that would eat his provisions. The goats, a brown doe, and her yearling daughter occupied a second side chamber that Willa had excavated and ventilated specifically for them. Their milk was a resource she had not had before, and its nutritional contribution to her diet had been significant. Her system was complete. Not perfect, she was always finding ways to refine it, always observing what worked and what could work better. But complete, self-sustaining, alive. And in the autumn of 1888, the animals were behaving in ways that Willa had never seen before. The pikas, the small, round-eared rock rabbits that colonized the talus slopes above the cave, were gathering dried grass with a frenzy that was qualitatively different from their ordinary autumn industriousness. She had been watching them for 2 years, and she knew their rhythms. This was not their ordinary rhythm. They moved with an urgency that suggested not merely preparation, but something closer to desperation, as though they were racing a deadline that they could feel and she could not yet see. The marmots went into hibernation 3 weeks early. 3 weeks. She noted this in her journal with underlines. The elk that normally grazed the high meadows above the ridge had descended 2 weeks ahead of their usual schedule, moving through the valley below in numbers she had never seen in the afternoon hours, as though they had made a collective calculation about where they wanted to be when whatever was coming arrived. And the wind from the north had changed in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, but unmistakable to someone who had been living with it for 2 years. It had a different edge, not merely colder, but somehow denser, as though it carried more in it than ordinary cold air carries, as though it had traveled a very long way over a very cold surface and had picked up the cold of that surface and was bringing it here. Her father had written near the back of his journal in a section she had read many times, "The animals understand weather in ways we have not yet learned to articulate. They do not have instruments or theories. They have bodies tuned by a million years of selection to survive, and survival means reading the future accurately. When the animals disagree with the almanac, trust the animals." She spent 3 weeks preparing. She hauled extra firewood, not because the cave needed it for heat, but because she cooked over fire and the winter might be long. She reinforced the hide that covered the cave entrance, adding 2 additional layers and constructing a small, cold trap vestibule at the entrance mouth that would prevent the outside air from reaching the cave interior directly. She double-checked her food stores, the dried meat from the rabbit and hare traps she maintained on the slope, the root vegetables she had harvested and stored in the cool section of the side chamber, the preserved mushrooms, the cheese she had been making from the goat's milk since early summer. She was not afraid, but she was paying attention. Down in Harrow's Bluff, they were celebrating. The harvest of 1888 was the finest in the town's history, a bumper crop of wheat and corn that overflowed the existing grain storage and made Garrison Voss's new $4,000 storehouse not merely a monument to his foresight, but a practical necessity that the town had been lucky to have ready in time. He stood before the town council in the third week of October, in the same office where 2 years earlier he had dispatched a hungry child to her death on a barren mountain, and he made the speech he had been composing in his mind since the first day of construction. "Providence has smiled upon us," he said. "This town, its people, its industry, its faith is secure for the winter. The storehouse is full, the cellars are stocked. No one in Harrow's Bluff shall know hunger." The council applauded. Silas Merrick, who had thought about Willa Thorne perhaps twice in the past 2 years, and had put both thoughts away without fully examining them, raised his glass with the practiced enthusiasm of a man whose comfort depends on the comfort of the man beside him. Hale, passing the office window on his way to the saloon, heard the applause and the general sound of celebration and felt the uncomplicated satisfaction of a young man who lives in a town that is doing well and regards that well-doing as the natural result of the town containing people like himself. He did not look at the mountain. No one did. On the morning of October 29, 1888, Willa Thorne sat at the entrance of her cave inside the hide curtain, looking out through the narrow gap at the sky to the north, and watched the color drain out of the world. The sky turned first, not the gray of an ordinary storm front, but something deeper and stranger, a bruised yellowish purple that had no business being in a sky, a color that felt like a warning in a language older than words. The air went absolutely still, the way air goes still before something very loud. She pulled the hide curtain closed. She checked the entrance seal. She went to Cinder's area and put her hand on the mare's neck and felt the horse's muscles tense the way animals go tense when they know something is coming that they cannot outrun. "I know," she said quietly. "We're ready." She went to the kale beds and checked them one last time. She went to the potato beds. She checked the goats. She lit 2 of the tallow lamps and set them in their places. Then she sat down on the stone bench she had built against the eastern wall in the steady, 55-degree warmth of the mountain's long breath, and she waited. Outside in the valley below, where 312 souls were celebrating the greatest harvest in memory, the sky continued to change. And then the storm arrived. It came as a wall, not as weather gradually intensifying, but as a solid moving force, a transformation of the world from one state to another in a matter of minutes. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than an hour. The snow that followed was not the gentle accumulation of an ordinary winter storm, but something more violent, driven horizontal by 60-mile-per-hour winds that turned individual snowflakes into projectiles and made visibility zero within the first hour. Willa heard it outside the hide curtain as a vast, sustained roar. Not the sound of wind she knew from 2 winters on the mountain, but something on a different scale entirely, as though the atmosphere itself had made a decision about this valley and this town and was implementing that decision with the indifference of geology. Inside the cave, the air was still. The temperature read 55 degrees. The kale was green. The goats shifted in their pen, and one of them made a soft sound that might have been complaint or might have been contentment. Willa opened her father's journal to the page she had read the most. Page 47, the cross-sectional map with its red ink pathways and its confident X, and she traced the thermal channels with her finger, the way she had traced them on the first night in the dark by firelight, when she had been 13 years old and just beginning to understand what her parents had left her. She thought about Garrison Voss's storehouse full to the rafters, with Harrow's Bluff's winter supply sitting in the valley below with its 6-month cured timber and its slightly undersized secondary framing and its proud flag of investment and certainty. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more complicated, the sorrow of someone who can see what is coming and is powerless to prevent it, who prepared for the right thing for the right reasons and now has to wait while the people who laughed at her preparation discover what unpreparedness costs. She pulled her coat around her shoulders. She listened to the mountain breathe. Outside, the ghost storm settled in for its 3-week stay, And in the valley below, Harrow's Bluff began to break. The storm did not pass. It settled. By the end of the first week, Harrow's Bluff had stopped expecting relief and had begun quietly to adjust its understanding of the world. This was no longer weather. This was condition. The sky did not clear. The wind did not ease. The cold did not fluctuate. Everything remained fixed in a state that felt less like a passing hardship and more like a decision made somewhere beyond human reach. At first, they tried to behave as though nothing fundamental had changed. Men still stepped outside in the morning to check on their animals, though most of those animals were already gone or dying. Women still prepared meals, though the portions grew smaller each day. Children were told stories at night to quiet their fear, though the adults telling them no longer believed in the endings. The storehouse remained the center of their confidence. It stood there on the eastern end of Main Street, buried halfway in snow, but still upright, still present, still holding everything that had been gathered through the most successful harvest the town had ever known. As long as it stood, they told themselves the town stood. That belief lasted 12 days. On the 13th, they tried to open it. The doors had frozen into place. Not stuck, not merely stiff, but sealed the seams packed with ice so dense it had become structural. They brought tools. They struck the hinges, the edges, the frame. The iron rang out sharply in the cold air, but the wood did not give. The ice absorbed the force and held. They worked in shifts until their hands lost feeling. By afternoon, the effort had stopped producing progress and had begun producing only exhaustion. Garrison Voss watched it all without speaking. He did not intervene. He did not redirect. For perhaps the first time since he had arrived in the valley, he did not know what the correct action was, and that uncertainty held him still. What he did notice, though, was the sound, not from the men, from the building. It was subtle, a low, intermittent strain that moved through the timber in long, slow pulses. Wood under pressure does not shout. It complains, it adjusts, it carries weight until it cannot. And there was a great deal of weight. Snow had not fallen in layers. It had been driven, compacted, forced against every surface by wind that did not rest. The roof carried more than it had been designed to carry. The walls resisted pressure from directions they had not been built to resist. The structure was no longer storing grain. It was containing a mountain. By the 15th day, the town had begun to ration what little food remained outside the storehouse. By the 17th, the conversations had changed. People stopped discussing when the storm would end and began discussing how long they could last if it did not. By the 19th day, no one spoke about abundance anymore. On the 21st, the storehouse failed. The collapse began with a single fracture along the central beam, a sharp crack that cut through the morning air and drew people out of their homes despite the cold. They did not need to understand structure to recognize finality. Something essential had broken. The beam split under the accumulated load, and once it did, the rest followed with brutal efficiency. Weight shifted, redistributed, found the weaknesses that had always been there and had never mattered until now. The lighter framing inside the walls gave way first, then the outer supports, and then the roof came down in a heavy, unstoppable descent that buried everything beneath it. The grain did not spill into the street, it disappeared. By the time the noise ended, the storehouse was no longer a building. It was a mound. And inside that mound was everything the town had planned to live on. They tried to dig, of course they tried, but digging in that cold through compacted snow and broken timber without proper tools and without enough strength left in their bodies to sustain the effort was not a solution. It was an expression of refusal. They worked until they could not feel their hands, until their breath came shallow and uneven, until even the attempt began to look like denial rather than action. After 2 days, the digging stopped. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The food was gone. Hunger arrived slowly, the way it always does. It did not announce itself. It did not demand attention. It simply reduced things. Meals became smaller, then fewer, then absent. Conversation narrowed. Movement slowed. The body began to conserve what it no longer had. Garrison Voss felt it like everyone else, but for him there was an additional weight layered on top of the physical one. Recognition. He had built the storehouse. He had approved the materials. He had stood inside it and declared it a symbol of permanence. He had believed in it with the same certainty he had believed in the order of the world that had brought him to that point. And now it was gone. Not taken, not stolen. Removed by something that had never acknowledged his ownership in the first place. It was Mayor Merrick who spoke the thought that had been moving unformed through the town. The girl, he said one evening, his voice low as though the storm itself might hear him. The one on the mountain. No one responded immediately, but no one dismissed it either. They all remembered. They had not thought about her in months, perhaps years, because thinking about her had required a kind of honesty they had not been interested in maintaining. It had been easier to assume she had died, easier to close the story. Now the story had returned. They said she lived, Merrick continued. The hunters, last summer. Garrison Voss did not look at him. He did not need to. He remembered the look in her eyes in the mayor's office. The certainty, the absence of pleading. I remember, he said. Silence followed. Not disagreement, not debate, just a slow, collective realization that something they had dismissed might now be the only thing left. 3 days later, they sent a group. Not many. They could not spare many. 3 men. One of them was Garrison Voss. The journey was not heroic. It was not framed that way in their minds. It was a calculation made under pressure. The mountain had not become kinder simply because the town had become desperate. It remained what it had always been, and the path to it, buried under snow and reshaped by wind, offered no guidance. They moved slowly, carefully. Each step required attention. Each decision carried consequence. One man turned back before the first night, his hands no longer responding to him. Another collapsed on the second day and did not rise again. Voss continued alone. He did not frame this as courage. He did not frame it at all. There was no narrative left in him to support that kind of thinking. There was only movement in the absence of alternatives. He found the junipers near midday on the second day. They stood out not because they were obvious, but because they were wrong. Too dense, too deliberate. Growth like that did not occur by accident on a slope like this. He pushed through them and found the rock face. He pressed his hand against it and felt warmth. Not imagined, not remembered, real. For a moment he did nothing, not because he doubted, because he understood. Then he stepped through. Inside, the air was still. The temperature held steady in a way that felt unnatural after weeks of violent fluctuation. Light, soft and diffused, reflected off the walls. There was green in the space. Living green. And Willa stood there. She was not the girl he had sent away. Not in any meaningful sense. Time had not simply passed over her. It had worked on her. Refined something. Removed what was unnecessary. Left behind a presence that did not ask for recognition and did not depend on it. He looked at her, and for the first time since he had built anything in that valley, he did not assume he understood what he was looking at. I did not expect you to live, he said. It was not meant as cruelty. It was accuracy. I did, she replied. There was no emphasis in her voice, no edge. Just fact. He nodded once as though acknowledging a correction. There are people in the valley, he said. They will not survive this winter, I know, she said. And you can, yes. He hesitated then, but only briefly. I need your help. The words did not come easily, not because he was unused to asking for things, but because he was unused to asking in a way that did not assume entitlement. Willa studied him, not as a person she had known, as a variable. You sent me here to die, she said. Yes. No defense followed. None was offered. She let the silence sit for a moment, not to punish, but to measure. I can help some of them, she said finally. Not all, not if they stay where they are. He waited. They have to come here, she continued, and they have to change how they think. This only works if they understand why it works. He did not fully understand what she meant, but he understood enough. He nodded again. That was the agreement. No ceremony, no forgiveness, no resolution, just alignment with reality. The climb began the next day. It was not orderly. It was not efficient. It was what desperate movement always is: uneven, painful, incomplete. Some made it, some did not. The mountain remained indifferent to the distinction, but enough reached the cave, enough to continue. By the time the storm broke weeks later, Harrow's Bluff was no longer what it had been. The number of its people had been reduced. The shape of its life had changed. The confidence it had once carried had been replaced by something quieter, more careful, less certain, and more real. And at the center of what remained, not in the valley, but on the mountain above it, there was a system that had been built not on belief, but on understanding. Garrison Voss stood at the edge of it one morning late in the winter, watching Willa move through the space she had created, and he saw with a clarity that came too late to prevent what had already happened, but early enough to change what came next, the cost of the mistake he had made. Not the apple, not the exile, the assumption behind both, that a person's worth could be measured by what they possessed. He had believed that. He no longer did. And the mountain which had not cared what he believed, it continued to breathe steady and unchanged beneath them all.